Welcome to my final presentation on the Native Americans belonging to the Caddo Nation. I've enjoyed learning so much about their history and seeing how they have adapted to modern times while still holding on to their rich culture. Even through the devastating struggles this tribe has faced throughout history, they have persevered in their way of life, and their tribe is still standing tall today. Let's start with some basic information about the Caddo Nation. Who are they? Where did they come from? Where are they now? Historically, the Caddo Nation was an alliance between three separate people groups: the Hasinai, Caddo, and Natchitoches. The name Caddo appears to have been a French abbreviation of the word Caddo, meaning real chief or chiefs. When I first looked into where this people group might have migrated from, I thought the theory of the Bering Strait was an accurate description of their migration. But after learning more about Caddo culture and where they settled in the New World, I now believe that the Caddo migrated from South America. I believe this for three reasons mainly. First, they settled in the lower part of the country, which puts them closer to South America. Second, there are certain parts of their culture that are similar to indigenous practices in tribes found in South America, like the practice of head flattening. And third, when white settlers started to push the Caddo out of their territory, many of them fled to Mexico. I'm assuming, emphasis on the assuming, that some of them would choose to seek safety in Mexico because they, or their ancestors, had been familiar with the land and its people, and knew that they could carry on their way of life there. That's my theory on migration, but again, it is just a theory. After they settled in the New World around 700 to 800 AD and came together as a people, the alliance between the Hasinai, Caddo, and the Natchitoches existed for centuries in the areas now known as Northwest Louisiana, East Texas, Southwest Arkansas, and Southeastern Oklahoma. In 1855, the U.S. government forced the Caddo people into a reservation on the Brazos River in Texas, but later moved them to southwestern Oklahoma in 1859. The Caddo Nation once had a large population. However, by the late 18th century, most of the Caddo had been affected by diseases brought by explorers, absolutely devastating their population. Death brought by disease reduced their tribal population by 75 to 90%. Those are staggering numbers. It is a wonder that they were able to come back from that kind of hit, but the Caddo are a strong people, as we will find out throughout the course of this presentation. According to recent tribal censuses, there are about 6,000 registered Caddo tribesmen and women, and roughly half of them reside in Oklahoma. The tribe's headquarters is located in Binger, Oklahoma today. Each Native American tribe has their own unique origin story that explains how the earth and its people came about. Many of these stories contain elements of joy, beauty, mystery, hope, mischief, and sadness. The story of origin that the Caddo people have passed down from generation to generation is quite sad in my opinion. However, a bit of hope can be found at the end when the bittersweet sting of death brings them back to their long-lost ancestors. The story relates that at the beginning of time, humans and animals were brothers and lived below ground together. After much searching, their leader, Nish, which translates to moon, found the entrance to a cave that led above ground to the surface world. He told the people and animals to follow him above ground, but warned them not to look back from where they had come. An old man climbed out first carrying fire, a pipe, and a drum, all items that are important aspects of Caddo beliefs and ceremonies. Next, the old man's wife climbed out carrying corn and pumpkin seeds, both extremely important subsistence crops for the Caddo people. After this, more people and their animal companions started to emerge until Wolf climbed out and looked back from where he had come. The earth where the cave entrance had been suddenly closed up, trapping the remaining people and animals underground where they still remain. The people and animals who had already emerged wept where the cave entrance had been, for their brothers and sisters who had been left behind. The people and animals that had emerged from the ground were then left to continue life in the surface world with the items they had carried with them: fire, a pipe, a drum, and seeds of corn and pumpkin. Because their ancestors came from the ground, the Caddo call the middle world Ina, which means mother, and return to it and the rest of their long-lost people when they die. People of the Caddo tribe were extremely skilled agriculturists, hunters, and craftsmen. For their living space, they built large post-framework houses that were covered in grass. As you can see from the picture to the right, these huts were very large and had the ability to house several families. Through my research, I learned that the Caddo people actually built 2 houses for themselves and their families. One for the winter, which looks like the one seen to the right, and one for the summer. Summer houses were constructed to accommodate the hot summers of the South, as they had basically screens woven from grass as walls. They grew crops such as corn, beans, pumpkins, amaranth, blackberries, potatoes, and more in the fertile soil surrounding their territory. They also foraged for other wild foodstuffs such as grapes, berries, acorns, pecans, and walnuts. The Caddo hunted animals like deer, bear, wild fowl, buffalo, antelope, and other small game for meat and supplies, along with taking yearly excursions to the Gulf Coast, where they could find turtles, seabird eggs, and other wild growing foods. The type of agriculture and hunting methods that they performed sustained them well into the 20th century. And they were always taught from a young age to be respectful to the earth. The Caddo believed that disrespecting the earth brought about destruction. The Caddo people were a very self-sustaining group for the most part. They were excellent at preserving and stockpiling their food, which set them apart from other tribes. I was really impressed with how well they were able to survive using their 2 hands, some ingenuity, and hard work. As I said earlier, the Caddo people were extremely skilled craftsmen. They created many useful things from the natural world around them, which became vital to their culture. They used the hides of the animals they hunted to make clothing and other garments, such as buffalo skin blankets with the fur left on for warmth in the winter, buckskin clothing, and moccasins. According to one of the websites I was doing research on called Caddo Cultures in Texas, the Caddo also grew cotton, which they would dye with fruits and vegetables and spin into beautiful fabrics. They would then decorate these fabrics with beads and embroidery. Other handcrafted items that were important to their way of life are detailed pottery, arrowheads, and tools which they would fashion out of wood, stone, and bone. In the picture on the right, you can see what the Caddo would have used as an axe for cutting down trees, among other things. It's made of wood and stone. The Caddo would also use wood that was native to their environment to create furniture, ceremonial masks, and the extraordinary bows made of bodark wood that they were very well known for. Among the men of the tribe, there were two popular hairstyles that would be worn. In one hairstyle, you could see the sides of the head shaved and painted, and then a mohawk left on top, which could be grown to waist length. An example of this hairstyle can be seen in the picture on the right. Sometimes the men would even wear what is called a porcupine roach in their hair, which you can also see in the picture of the tribal man to the right. The second popular hairstyle for Caddo men was to have the hair all around the head cut to about 4 inches or shorter, except for a patch on the crown of the head that was left to grow long. When it came to tribal women, they usually parted their long hair down the middle, like we can see in the picture, or they tied it in a knot at the nape of their necks. It was also common to see many men and women with painted designs or tattoos in various places on their bodies to signify their belonging in different tribes, clans, and societies. Like many other tribes, the Caddo people have had less than pleasant dealings with the United States government and its legislation. Beginning in the early 1820s, increased Anglo migration into Caddo territory impacted the Caddo's sacred landscape and forever altered their way of life. Caddo chiefs surrendered their land in 1835 within the United States territory in a forced land cession. The Caddo retreated to Texas and Mexico. During the 1840s and 1850s, the Caddo were forcibly pushed out of East Texas by Anglo settlers. Some Caddo moved into Indian Territory, while others traveled west into the upper Brazos River Valley. In 1859, the Caddo people were forced, once again, to abandon their homes in the upper Brazos River Valley and were moved to present-day Anadarko, Oklahoma, into Indian Territory. Unfortunately, the kind U.S. Indian agent in Texas, who helped the Caddo relocate to Oklahoma, Major Robert Neighbors, was brutally murdered during his return trip to Texas. It was determined that he was murdered for providing assistance to the Caddo people. To this day, the Caddo visit and clean up his gravesite to honor his dedication and kindness to them. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which authorized distribution of tribal communal land holdings into allotments for individual households. This was intended to extinguish tribal Native American land claims so that Oklahoma could become a state, as well as an attempt to assimilate Native Americans into the majority culture. Tribal governments were also dismantled, devastating the Caddo Nation and their way of life for many years. Hope was on the horizon, however, with the passing of the Indian Reorganization Act and the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act in 1934 and 1936. These acts helped restore the Caddo Nation's tribal government. They adopted a written constitution and election process and organized in 1938 as the Caddo Indian Tribe of Oklahoma. The Caddo people of today are U.S. citizens. Therefore, they must follow local, state, and federal laws. However, they have their own government, laws, police, and political organizations as well. They are kind of like a small country inside of a bigger country. The Caddo work closely with the government in some respects, in that they operate an active NAGPRA office at their headquarters in Binger, Oklahoma. While I'm sure relations between the Caddo and the U.S. government aren't as turbulent as in times past, there are most likely areas that could be improved. Tribal sovereignty is probably one of those areas. Historically, the Caddo Indians mostly had amicable relationships with other tribes and outside explorers. The only tribes that they had somewhat strained relations with were the Chickasaw and the Osage, and disputes were mainly over hunting territory. When the Spanish and French explorers encountered the Caddo, they regarded them as a very sophisticated people group because of their skills with agriculture, hunting, crafting, and trading. Historically, the Caddo Indians traced descent through the maternal line, and this practice was still reflected by kinship terms recorded as late as the early 1900s. Tracing ancestry through matrilineal descent is a common practice for many Native American tribes. The Caddo Indians also identified themselves by their clans. The clans were kinship groups that traced their heritage to a common ancestor through the female line. These clans were often named after an animal or celestial phenomenon, such as the Bear Clan or the Thunder Clan, and were ranked in a hierarchical system. The leaders of the different Caddo nations most likely were members of the highest-ranking clans and could be recognized by their flattened heads. Head flattening can be seen among certain Native American tribes. It is a process in which the head is flattened from birth, with the use of straps and paddle boards. Elite leaders of clans could be seen with these flattened heads and other status symbols. These leaders were in charge of directing political and religious activities. Marriage within the Caddo tribe typically occurred between members of different clans. Caddo society was communal, woven together and tightly bound by kinship, custom, and the expectations found within each community. Another social aspect of the historic Caddoans was their participation in large trade networks with other tribes and outside explorers. While the value of community is still very important to the Caddo people today, there are many differences, as to be expected. In modern times, it appears that the Caddo tribe uses blood quantum levels to determine Caddo descent. To become an enrolled member of the tribe today, a person must have a 1/16th Caddo blood quantum level. In regard to modern marriage customs of the Caddo, I would assume that the tribe members are free to marry whomever they wish. While these aspects of social life have changed for the Caddo, they still hold fast to many of their historic traditions. The tribe has several programs in place to help invigorate Caddo culture, which include summer culture camps for children, Caddo song and dance lessons and performances by the Hassanai Society and Caddo Culture Club, and the Kiwat and Hassanai Foundation's work to preserve and increase the use of the Caddo language. Modern-day tribe members also participate in many traditional ceremonies in which they are able to tell their story through song, dance, and customary dress. Tribe members are even given their own license plates for their cars to signify their belonging. In this slide, I wanted to include a short clip of a video I found on YouTube of Caddo dancers and singers performing the Caddo swing dance. This video was posted by the National Indian Education Association and shows the Caddo tribe presenting their dance and music traditions at the NIEA 2012 Cultural Feast at the Oklahoma History Center in Oklahoma City. When you watch the video, you'll see what I'm talking about, but one of the things that I really liked about this performance is that you can see elderly tribe members, grade school age tribe members, and every age in between. It really shows how the Caddo people are keeping their traditions alive by passing them on to the next generation. So here's the video. So I thought that was a pretty cool video. I cut it short because it was a pretty long video, but at the end of the video, the boys and men who came and grabbed the women and started dancing with them returned the women to the circle, and they end the song as a circle around the drummers. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, leaders of various Caddo tribes were members of the highest-ranking clans and could be recognized by their flattened heads and other status symbols. You can see in the picture on the right the process of how they flatten the babies' heads and kind of what it looks like as they grow older. These leaders were in charge of directing religious and political activities. The Chinese, meaning Mr. Moon, were in charge of religious leadership, ceremonies, and providing connection with the supreme god, the Caddo. The Caddi were in charge of political activities. This position was one that passed from father to son. The Caddi was in charge of making important political decisions for the tribe, was head of major diplomatic ceremonies, led war councils, and conducted peace pipe ceremonies with honored guests, among other duties. The Kanahas were high-ranking elders that were often consulted by the Caddi regarding important decisions or events. And finally, we have the Tamas, which were a type of tribal police, if you will. Their jobs were to make sure that orders were obeyed and that everyone was behaving how they should be. These elite tribal leaders were often buried in large, elaborate mounds constructed by the people. These burial mounds were sacred to the Caddo people and other mound-building tribes as well. An example of what these mounds look like today can be seen in the pictures to the right. This is a section of the Spiro mounds found in Oklahoma. While the tradition of head flattening among leaders is long outdated, the Caddo Indian tribe of Oklahoma still has a strong sense of leadership with their active 8-person elected council to oversee tribal life. In order to update their original 1938 Constitution, they drafted a new Constitution in 1976, but continued their tradition of an elected representative government. In 2002, they adopted 6 new amendments to their Constitution, one of these pertaining to blood quantum levels for enrollment. The Caddo's Constitution allows for the election of an 8-person council, with the chairperson acting as the head. Currently, the acting chairperson is Tamara M. Francis, who was re-elected in 2016. Francis is the daughter of the first elected female chairperson and the 4th elected female leader of the Caddo Nation. The rest of the tribal council positions include a vice chairperson, secretary, treasurer, Oklahoma City representative, Binger representative, Fort Cobb representative, and an Anadarko representative. In the picture to the right, we can see Tamara Francis being sworn into office after winning her first election as chairperson of the Caddo tribe. Historically, the Caddo were heavily involved in trading networks between other tribes and outside explorers. They would trade handmade creations such as their pottery, arrowheads, foodstuffs, and their exquisite bows made of bodark wood. They even participated in the French fur trade and other trading operations. The Caddo were exceptional at sustaining themselves, but trade was also very important. 20th century efforts to revitalize economic, social, political, and religious institutions and preserve links with their heritage enable the Caddo people to maintain a distinctive identity today and continue building toward a future that is thriving. The Caddo people do this by building upon their tribal programs, gaming, and heritage and culture initiatives. For instance, the Caddo Nation Children's Clothing Assistance, funded through the Tribal Tag Office Section 109 programs, awards each enrolled child $75 to assist families with back-to-school expenses. Furthermore, the Bison Ridge Casino and Travel Lodge promotes tribal economic development, self-sufficiency, and sovereignty. The Caddo tribe also operates its own housing authority and run an administrative center, several community centers, the Caddo Nation Heritage Museum, and an active NAGPRA office. Tribal artists also sell their creations, such as pottery, cultural items, and traditional style clothing to make a living. Much of Caddo religious beliefs are connected to their origin story, oral folklore, traditional stories, and supernatural figures. The Caddo believed in one supreme being called the Caddo, which translates to Sky Chief. Other important mythological figures include the twins, Village Boy and Wild Boy, called Konanisi, who are associated with thunder and lightning. There's Coyote, who is the source of mischief and trickery, the Kadaha, who is a frightening man-eating ogre, and the Lost Elves, who are tiny ghostly people who steal those who get lost in the woods. The Caddo used all of these mythological figures, along with many others, to create one big conglomeration of beliefs about the world around them. Each occurrence in life could be explained by a story. The Caddo mixed these stories with song and dance in the numerous ceremonies that were held throughout the year. Modern-day Caddo religious beliefs include the long-standing tradition of the ghost dance and adherence to the practices found within the Native American Church, which also includes some elements of Christianity. The ghost dance is done in the style of the circle dance, which is performed to musical accompaniment such as rhythm instruments and singing. Historically, it was believed that proper practice of the dance would reunite the living with spirits of the dead, bring the spirits to fight on their behalf, make white colonists leave, and bring peace, prosperity, and unity to Native American peoples throughout the region. The Caddo meshed the practice of this dance with the practices found in the Native American Church. The Native American Church is a religion that teaches a combination of traditional Native American beliefs and Christianity, with the sacramental use of entheogen peyote. In addition, the Caddo are involved with many festivals and ceremonies to celebrate their tradition and belief systems. When it came time to select a contemporary issue that pertains to my tribe, I searched high and low for current information on my tribe and can barely find much of anything. So instead, I decided to cover a contemporary issue that is important to all Native American tribes in this country, which is the protection of Indian burial grounds and the repatriation of artifacts found at these sites to the tribes in which they belong. The legislation written for this protection is known as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, and was enacted on November 16, 1990. The issue of grave protection is important to Native American tribes today for a handful of reasons, but one stands out from the rest. The passing and enforcement of this legislation is a monumental step in the way of tribal sovereignty and respect. Congress, the scientific community, and museums are acknowledging the ownership and cultural belief systems of tribes with this act, and working with them to return what is rightfully theirs. Furthermore, historical law practices did not leave room for consideration of Native American culture, and this is why there had to be a change. Native American tribes had several reasons to advocate for the protection of their dead and all objects buried with them. Not only were these reasons justified by their cultural beliefs surrounding those who had passed, but also by law, mainly state statutory law, common law, equal protection, First Amendment rights, sovereignty, and treaties. Many historic state laws only put forth regulations and protections on marked graves. The problem with this is that many Native American graves were unmarked, leaving them unprotected by state law. Additionally, much of the legal system developed during the settlement of the New World did not leave room for consideration of Native American beliefs and practices surrounding their deceased brethren, as well as other issues such as Indian removal from their homelands. With equal protection of grave sites, as well as artifacts found at those grave sites, many Native Americans felt that the burial sites of their dead were and are treated in a different way than the dead of other races, most likely because they are the First Nations of this country. In regard to Native Americans' First Amendment rights, the issue laid in these rights being overlooked by the U.S. government when it came to the unique religious beliefs and practices attached to the burial of tribal dead. According to many Native Americans, when the grave sites of their dead, along with the artifacts or remains found there, are disturbed, damaged, or withheld from burial, the rights afforded to them by the First Amendment are being violated. Because of their history, Native American tribes are afforded a unique sovereignty over their affairs. It was believed by Native Americans that the relationships, practices, and beliefs surrounding their dead and how they bury them is a tribal matter and should be addressed by the sovereign jurisdiction of the tribes and not the government and its affiliates. Finally, we come to the matter of treaties that have been forged between Native Americans and the United States government. From the time the first treaty between these two nations was penned, it was understood that tribes would maintain rights laid out in the treaties unless they decided to hand them over to the U.S. government. The right to tamper with Native American grave sites and the artifacts found within has never been signed over to the government in any existing treaty. Therefore, the government has no right to disturb the sites where Native American dead are buried. Conditions of treaties between the government and Native Americans have often been bent or broken by the U.S. government, leading to the call for legislation such as NAGPRA. Basically, NAGPRA establishes the ownership of human remains, funerary objects, and other cultural items excavated or discovered on tribal or federal land. Though NAGPRA is making big steps in regulating Indian burial sites on federal and tribal land, its regulations still do not apply to private land. NAGPRA does not have any jurisdiction over private land, but the Act makes it a punishable offense to traffic in Native American human remains or cultural items, no matter where those items were found. First-time violation of this regulation may lead to a year in prison and a hefty $100,000 fine. The guidelines of NAGPRA state that Native American remains and funerary objects belong to lineal descendants of the artifacts. If no lineal descendants can be found, the artifacts belong to the tribe whose land they were found on, or the tribe with the closest relation to the artifacts. NAGPRA requires each federally funded agency, museum, or institution keep inventory of tribal objects in their possession and then repatriate those objects when asked by tribes or officials. Statistics from the National Park Service show that, as of 2016, Nearly 1.8 million artifacts were returned back to tribes under NAGPRA regulations since its enactment. These artifacts include 57,847 human remains, 1,479,923 funerary objects, 243,198 unassociated funerary objects, and 5,136 sacred objects. I'm positive these numbers have grown even more in the past 3 years. One of the most well-known and successful tribes today are the Cherokee. When we compare the contemporary elements of the Cherokee tribe to that of the Caddo Nation, we can see many similarities and some distinct differences. One huge difference between the two tribes is their size and popularity. The Caddo operate on a much smaller scale than the Cherokee, and they are not a very well-known tribe. In comparison, I'm sure that if you asked every person in the United States if they had ever heard of the Cherokee Indians, they would say that they had. When comparing these two tribes in my research, I was able to find an abundance of information on almost every aspect of historical and modern-day Cherokee life. But when I was trying to find current information on the Caddo tribe, I kept hitting brick walls left and right. Though we see some differences like this, there are many similarities as well. Just like we see within the Caddo tribes, Cherokee descent was traced through the female line, and they also married outside of their clans. Kinship was, and still is, extremely important to the Cherokee as well as the Caddo. When it comes to the economics of the two tribes, I have found that the Cherokee tribe is much more involved in the casino industry than the Caddo tribe, and the Cherokee make much of their revenue from tourism. Also, I found that the Cherokee and the Caddo Indians both utilize a tribal council to oversee tribal affairs. It is interesting to see how similar some of these tribes are, even though they may be miles apart. As you can see through all of the information I have covered, the Caddo Indians have experienced several high points throughout history, but also several devastating points that nearly destroyed them as a people. Their strength, determination, and closely held beliefs helped them push past the trying times and come out thriving in the 21st century. Here are all of the sources I used to find my information. Many of them had so many interesting facts about the historic lives of the Caddo people. I loved learning about this tribe of people, and I'm so glad that their culture has survived to see the present. Thank you so much for listening to the story of the Caddo people.